The day my family forced me out of the company, nobody raised their voice. Nobody argued. Nobody even looked uncomfortable. That was probably the worst part. After 30 years in the family business, I expected disagreement. Maybe a debate. Maybe a difficult conversation. Instead, the decision felt rehearsed. Like everyone in the room already knew what was going to happen, except me. My name is Daniel Mercer, and 3 weeks after my father's funeral, my family voted me out of Mercer Mechanical, the company my father built, the company I spent most of my adult life helping run, the company I thought would always be part of my future. The meeting took place in our conference room on a Tuesday morning. My mother sat at the head of the table. My younger brother, Kevin, sat beside her. 2 of my sisters joined remotely. The company attorney was present, so was our accountant. Everyone looked serious, professional, prepared. That should have been my first warning. My mother spoke first. She thanked everyone for coming, talked about moving forward, talked about honoring my father's legacy. Then she said something that changed everything. I think it's time for new leadership. The room went quiet. Kevin lowered his eyes. Not because he was surprised, because he already knew where this was going. One of my sisters immediately agreed, then the other. The attorney remained silent. The accountant stared at the table. And within 10 minutes, the future of the company had been decided. Kevin would become CEO. I would be removed from executive management. If I wanted to stay, I could remain as an employee. An employee. After decades helping build the company. I looked around the room, waiting for someone to object. Nobody did. That's when I realized something. This wasn't a discussion. It was a plan. A plan everyone had agreed to before I ever entered the room. So I stood up, collected my notebook, and walked out. No argument, no speech, no threats, just silence. Behind me, I could already hear people discussing Kevin's transition into leadership. They sounded relieved, excited even, like a problem had finally been solved. What none of them realized was that they had just made the biggest mistake in company history. Because while they controlled the business, I controlled the building. The building that housed every office, every warehouse operation, every employee, every piece of equipment. The building Mercer Mechanical had operated from for more than 20 years. A building everyone assumed belonged to the company. A building that legally belonged to exactly one person, me. 3 weeks later, my family was about to learn something they should have known all along. Because the company may have belonged to them. But the ground beneath it never did. 23 years earlier, Mercer Mechanical was 6 months away from losing the building it operated from. At the time, nobody would have described us as a successful company. We weren't growing, we weren't expanding. Most months, we were simply trying to survive. The owner of our warehouse had decided to sell the property, and our lease would not be renewed. That single decision created a crisis we weren't prepared for. Without a warehouse, we couldn't store equipment. Without equipment, we couldn't service customers. And without customers, there would be no business left to save. My father spent weeks searching for solutions. He met with banks, spoke with lenders, filled out applications. Every answer was the same: rejected. Mercer Mechanical didn't have enough assets. It didn't have enough history. And according to the banks, it didn't have enough stability. I still remember sitting across from my father as he opened another rejection letter. For the first time in my life, he looked completely defeated because he understood something I was only beginning to realize. Without a building, Mercer Mechanical wasn't going to survive much longer. That's when I found the property. It sat on the edge of town in an aging industrial district that most businesses had already abandoned. The building looked terrible. Several windows were broken. Part of the roof needed repairs. The loading area was cracked and overgrown with weeds. Most buyers would have driven past without slowing down. But I kept coming back, not because it was attractive, because it was affordable. The owner had been trying to sell it for years and was becoming desperate. For the first time, I thought we might actually have a chance. I brought the listing to my father. He walked through the property with me one Saturday morning. By the end of the visit, he agreed it could work. The problem wasn't the building, the problem was money. Mercer Mechanical still couldn't qualify for financing. The banks had already made that clear. For weeks, we searched for another solution. We talked to lenders. We explored partnerships. We considered renting again. Every option led to the same conclusion. If the company couldn't buy the building, someone else would have to. And eventually, I realized that someone was going to be me. The decision terrified me. At the time, I was only 21 years old. I didn't have much money, I didn't own a home, and I certainly wasn't planning to become a commercial property owner. But the alternative was far worse. If nobody bought the building, Mercer Mechanical would lose its headquarters. The company my father had spent decades building might not survive. So I took a risk that nobody asked me to take. I emptied my savings account, sold my truck, borrowed money from an uncle, then signed a personal loan that kept me awake at night. Not a business loan, a personal loan tied entirely to my name. If everything failed, I would be responsible for every dollar. A few weeks later, the deal closed. The deed listed exactly one owner, Daniel Mercer, not Mercer Mechanical, not my father, not a family trust, just me. At the time, nobody cared whose name appeared on the paperwork. They only cared that the company had a future. And for many years, that seemed like enough. We moved into the building less than a month later. The difference was immediate. For the first time in years, the company had stability. We weren't worried about being forced to relocate. We could finally focus on growth instead of survival. And that's exactly what happened. Over the next 2 decades, Mercer Mechanical expanded far beyond anything we expected. Revenue increased. New employees were hired. Major commercial clients signed long-term contracts. The company became one of the most respected HVAC contractors in the region. As the business grew, something else happened. People started forgetting. New employees assumed the building belonged to the company. Customers assumed it belonged to my father. Even family members stopped talking about how we acquired it. Nobody ever asked who actually owned the property, and I never felt the need to remind them. Why would I? We were family. The company was thriving. Ownership seemed like an unimportant detail. Looking back, that assumption became a very expensive mistake, because years later, when my family decided they no longer needed me, they forgot one important fact. The company may have belonged to them, but the building never did. For a while, everything worked exactly the way it was supposed to. The company grew, the building increased in value, and my father finally stopped worrying about whether Mercer Mechanical would survive another year. Looking back, I think that's when the problem started. Not because the company became successful, because people began taking that success for granted, especially my brother. Kevin joined the business full-time a few years after I did. Unlike me, he wasn't interested in operations. He preferred sales, networking, client relationships, and to be fair, he was good at it. Customers liked him, employees enjoyed being around him. He had a personality that naturally attracted attention. I didn't. I was usually the person solving problems nobody else wanted to deal with. The person working late when equipment broke. The person handling emergencies when projects went wrong. The person making sure promises became reality. Over time, something interesting happened. People started associating the company's success with Kevin. Not because he was doing more work, because he was doing more visible work. If we landed a major client, Kevin got credit for the relationship. If we completed a large project, clients remembered the person who signed the contract. They rarely remembered the person who coordinated everything afterward. I didn't complain about it, at least not in the beginning. Then one evening, during a company anniversary dinner, my father stood up to make a speech. He thanked employees. He thanked customers. Then he thanked Kevin, specifically Kevin, for helping grow the business. The room applauded. Kevin smiled. My father continued talking about the company's future, but something caught my attention. Not once did he mention the building. Not once did he mention the risk that had made everything possible, and certainly not the person who took that risk. For the first time, I realized something. People weren't forgetting by accident anymore. They were simply getting used to a version of the story where my contribution no longer mattered. A few years later, my father's health began to decline. Nothing dramatic at first, just enough that he started stepping back from day-to-day operations. As that happened, Kevin became more involved in leadership decisions. At least, that's how it looked from the outside. The reality was very different. Kevin attended meetings, I ran the business, he met with clients, I managed projects, he talked about growth, I dealt with the problems that came with it. For a long time, the arrangement worked. Then we landed the largest contract in company history. A regional hospital network needed a complete HVAC upgrade across multiple facilities. The project was worth millions. Winning it changed everything. What nobody saw were the 6 months leading up to the agreement, the negotiations, the planning, the staffing challenges, the budget projections. I spent countless nights making sure we could actually deliver what Kevin was promising. Because winning a contract is easy, fulfilling it is hard. When the deal was finally announced, the company held a celebration. Employees gathered in the warehouse. My father attended despite his declining health. Everyone was excited, and they had every reason to be. Then my father took the microphone. He thanked the management team, thanked the employees. Then he turned toward Kevin. This contract represents the future of Mercer Mechanical. The room applauded. My father smiled proudly. And Kevin made it happen. The applause grew louder. People stood. Employees cheered. Kevin looked humbled. At least he pretended to be. I stood near the back of the room and watched. Not because I wanted recognition, because I realized nobody even understood what had happened. They saw the person who closed the deal. They didn't see the person who made the deal possible. And the more successful the company became, the easier it was for everyone to forget who was carrying the weight behind the scenes. As my father's health continued to decline, something else began to change. Kevin stopped acting like a partner. He started acting like a successor. At first, the changes were small. He began making decisions without consulting me. Nothing major, just little things. New hires, vendor relationships, equipment purchases, the kind of decisions we had always discussed together. When I brought it up, Kevin brushed it off. "We need to move faster." That was his favorite phrase. Move faster. What he really meant was stop asking questions. The problem was that Kevin only saw the opportunities. I saw the risks. Because while he spent most of his time talking about growth, I was the one responsible when things went wrong. Then one afternoon, I walked into a meeting I hadn't been invited to. Several department managers were gathered around the conference table. Kevin was leading the discussion. The moment I entered, the room became quiet. An awkward silence settled over everyone. I knew immediately something wasn't right. Kevin smiled, a little too quickly. Then he explained they were discussing the company's long-term leadership structure. Leadership structure. A conversation that somehow involved every senior manager except me. That was the moment I realized this wasn't accidental. Kevin wasn't preparing for the future. He was preparing for control. Over the following months, it happened again and again. Important meetings scheduled without me. Decisions made before I was informed. Conversations that suddenly stopped when I entered a room. None of it was serious enough to create a confrontation. But together, the pattern became impossible to ignore. For the first time in my life, I felt like an outsider inside my own company. The company I helped save, the company I helped build, and the company operating from a building that everyone seemed to have forgotten belonged to me. Looking back, I should have recognized the warning signs sooner, because by then, my removal wasn't being discussed. It was already being planned. The final warning came 3 weeks before my father died. At the time, he had already stepped away from most daily operations. He still came into the office occasionally. But everyone knew the company was preparing for a transition. One afternoon, I arrived early for a budget meeting and noticed several vehicles already parked outside. That was unusual. The meeting wasn't scheduled to start for another hour. When I entered the conference room, Kevin was sitting with my mother, our attorney, and 2 of my sisters. The conversation stopped the moment I walked in. Nobody looked surprised to see me. They looked uncomfortable. That bothered me more, because uncomfortable people are usually hiding something. Kevin immediately changed the subject. My mother smiled and asked about a customer project. The attorney gathered his papers, and within seconds, whatever they had been discussing disappeared. Or at least, that's what they wanted me to believe. The meeting itself was uneventful. Budgets, forecasts, hiring plans, nothing unusual. But as everyone prepared to leave, I noticed a document sitting face down near the end of the table. Most of it was covered. Only a few words were visible. Succession planning. That was enough. I didn't say anything. I didn't ask questions. But the message was clear. Conversations about the future were already happening, and I wasn't part of them. Over the next few weeks, the distance between Kevin and me grew larger. Calls went unanswered. Meetings happened without me. Important decisions reached me after they had already been made. Then my father passed away. The company stopped. The family gathered. And for a brief moment, none of the business politics seemed important anymore. I told myself we would figure things out together. As a family, I was wrong. Because while I was grieving my father, everyone else was preparing for the meeting that would remove me from the company. The meeting where they would finally reveal how little they thought they needed me. 3 weeks after my father's funeral, the meeting finally happened. Officially, it was described as a leadership transition meeting. Unofficially, it was something very different. The room was already full when I arrived. My mother sat at the head of the conference table. Kevin sat beside her. Our attorney was present. So was the company's accountant. Several senior managers had been invited as observers. The atmosphere felt strangely formal, almost rehearsed. I should have recognized the signs immediately. Instead, I sat down and waited for the discussion to begin. My mother spoke first. She thanked everyone for attending. Then she spent several minutes talking about my father's legacy, the company, the employees, the future. Everything sounded reasonable, until it didn't. Eventually, she looked toward Kevin, then toward me, and finally said the words I had been dreading for months. "I think it's time for new leadership." The room fell silent, not surprised, prepared, as if everyone already knew exactly what came next. My younger brother nodded slowly. One of my sisters immediately voiced her support, then the other. The attorney remained silent. The accountant avoided eye contact, and within a matter of minutes, the discussion became a formality. Kevin would become CEO. The executive structure would be reorganized, and my role would be eliminated. Just like that, no debate, no questions, no acknowledgement of the years I had spent helping build the company, only a decision, one that had clearly been made before I ever entered the room. I looked around the table, waiting for someone to object. Nobody did. Not a manager, not a family member. Nobody. Then my mother delivered the part that hurt most. "If you'd like to stay, you're welcome to remain with the company. Remain with the company as an employee." The words hung in the air. After everything that had happened, after every sacrifice, after every risk, they genuinely believed I would stay. I almost laughed. Not because it was funny, because it was unbelievable. They thought ownership and responsibility were the same thing. They thought the company could simply replace the person carrying half its weight. And they thought I needed them more than they needed me. They were wrong, but I didn't argue. I didn't remind them of the building. I didn't mention the deed. I didn't reveal anything at all. Instead, I stood up, collected my notebook, thanked everyone for their time, and walked out. Behind me, the meeting continued. I could hear voices discussing transition plans, future strategies, Kevin's leadership, as if nothing important had just happened, as if the company had simply removed one employee and moved on. For the next 3 weeks, nobody called, nobody apologized, nobody attempted to change my mind. That told me everything I needed to know. They weren't expecting resistance. They were expecting acceptance. Then, exactly 21 days after that meeting, Mercer Mechanical received a letter from a real estate attorney. Not from me, from my lawyer. A lawyer whose name nobody in my family recognized. Inside was a simple notification. The commercial property occupied by Mercer Mechanical was privately owned. The current lease agreement would not be renewed under its existing terms, and all future occupancy discussions would be handled directly through the property's owner. The final line contained the detail that changed everything. The property owner was Daniel Mercer. For the first time in more than 20 years, my family remembered who actually owned the building. The reaction was immediate. Less than an hour after the letter arrived, my phone started ringing. First Kevin, then my mother, then one of my sisters. I ignored every call, not because I was angry, because there was nothing left to discuss. Everything they needed to know was already in the letter. By the end of the day, the calls became messages, then emails, then voicemails, all asking the same question. How was this possible? The answer was simple. They never asked. For more than 20 years, Everyone assumed the building belonged to the company. Nobody bothered to verify it. Nobody checked the deed. Nobody reviewed the ownership records. They simply accepted the version of the story that was most convenient. The next morning, Kevin finally reached me through a mutual friend. We met at a coffee shop halfway across town. The moment he sat down, I could tell he wasn't there to apologize. He was there to negotiate. "You can't do this," he said. I almost smiled. Not because the situation was funny, because it was the exact same phrase the banks had used 23 years earlier when I tried to buy the building. I calmly asked what part of the letter was inaccurate. Kevin didn't answer. Instead, he talked about the employees, the customers, the reputation of the company, everything except the real issue. Eventually, I stopped him. "Did you know I owned the building?" For the first time, he looked away. That told me everything. He hadn't known. Neither had my mother. Neither had my sisters. The family that had spent months planning my removal had never spent 5 minutes checking who actually controlled the property they depended on. And now, for the first time, they understood the position they were in. The company had pushed me out, but they couldn't push me out of a building that legally belonged to me. For the next few days, my family focused on one thing: proving the letter was wrong. They hired attorneys, reviewed company records, searched through decades of paperwork. Surely there had to be a mistake. Surely the building had been transferred to the company at some point. It hadn't. Every document pointed to the same conclusion. The building belonged to me. It always had. A week later, Kevin requested another meeting. This time, he brought the company attorney. I brought mine. The difference in atmosphere was impossible to miss. 3 weeks earlier, they had treated me like someone whose opinion no longer mattered. Now they were speaking carefully, choosing every word, asking instead of telling. The attorney explained that relocating the company would be difficult, far more difficult than anyone had realized. The building wasn't just office space. It housed equipment, inventory, service vehicles, dispatch operations, everything. Moving would cost a fortune. Finding another suitable property could take months, possibly longer. I listened quietly. Then I asked a simple question. What was the plan if I had stayed? Nobody answered. The room fell silent. Because everyone knew the truth. There was no plan. They expected me to accept my new role, accept Kevin's authority, accept being pushed aside. The possibility that I might leave had never been taken seriously. That realization seemed to hit Kevin harder than anything else. For the first time, he wasn't dealing with an employee or a brother. He was dealing with the consequences of a decision he couldn't reverse. And the more their lawyers investigated, the worse the situation became, because they weren't just dependent on the building. They were dependent on a lease agreement that was about to expire. That was when the panic started. Not publicly, not yet. But behind closed doors, everyone at Mercer Mechanical was scrambling for answers. The lease agreement had less than 4 months remaining. For years, nobody had paid attention to it. Why would they? The company had occupied the same building for more than 2 decades. Everyone assumed it would continue indefinitely. Now that assumption had become a problem. The leadership team began exploring alternatives. Several commercial properties were reviewed. None worked. Some were too small. Others were too expensive. A few were already committed to other tenants. Even worse, several of Mercer Mechanical's largest contracts required operational stability. Major clients wanted reassurance that service would continue without interruption. For the first time, customers started asking questions. Questions Kevin couldn't easily answer. Meanwhile, rumors spread through the company. Employees talked. Managers speculated. People wanted to know why attorneys were suddenly attending meetings, why relocation plans were being discussed, why leadership seemed nervous. Then one of the senior managers called me, a man who had worked with me for nearly 15 years. After a few minutes of small talk, he finally asked the question everyone was thinking. Did they really push you out? I told him the truth. Yes. The line went quiet. Then he laughed. Not because it was funny, because he couldn't believe it. Neither could most of the employees once the story began circulating. For years, they had watched me solve problems nobody else wanted, handle crises nobody else could manage. And now the same people who removed me were discovering just how much of the company's foundation depended on decisions I had made decades earlier. The building wasn't the problem. The real problem was what the building represented. For the first time, Mercer Mechanical was learning the difference between visible leadership and the person who quietly held everything together. 2 weeks later, my family finally stopped pretending this was a misunderstanding. It wasn't. The attorneys had reviewed everything. The accountants had reviewed everything. The county records were clear. I owned the building. And more importantly, I had every legal right to decide what happened next. That's when my mother asked to meet, not as a board member, not as a representative of the company, as my mother. We met at a small restaurant near the edge of town. For a few minutes, neither of us talked about the business. We talked about my father, his health, the funeral, the things families talk about when they're avoiding the real subject. Eventually, she looked at me and asked the question I knew was coming. "What do you want?" The answer surprised her, because it wasn't money. It wasn't revenge, and it certainly wasn't control of the company. "I want to understand why nobody thought I mattered until now." For the first time, she didn't have an answer. She looked down at the table, silent. The truth was sitting between us. For years, my family had confused visibility with value. Kevin was visible. I wasn't. So they assumed he was more important. The building proved otherwise. Not because it was worth millions, because it existed at all. Without it, Mercer Mechanical would have disappeared decades earlier. My mother finally admitted something she had never said before. "We thought you'd stay." Just like that. No elaborate explanation, no complicated justification, just a simple assumption. They believed I would continue carrying responsibility no matter how I was treated. And that assumption had shaped every decision they made. By the time the conversation ended, one thing had become painfully clear. My family wasn't facing a property problem. They were facing the consequences of taking someone for granted for more than 20 years. And those consequences were only beginning. 3 days after meeting with my mother, Kevin called again. This time, he wasn't angry. He wasn't demanding answers. He sounded tired. The kind of tired that comes from realizing a problem isn't going away. "We need to talk," he said. I agreed to meet. Not because I owed him anything, because I was curious. For years, Kevin had always spoken with confidence. Now that confidence was gone. When we sat down, he got straight to the point. The company was struggling. Not financially. Not yet. But the uncertainty was spreading. Employees were worried. Managers were distracted. Several clients had already asked whether Mercer Mechanical would be relocating. The leadership team didn't have answers, and people were beginning to notice. For the first time, Kevin wasn't talking like a CEO. He was talking like someone who had lost control of the situation. "What do you want from us?" he asked. I looked at him for a moment. Then I gave him the same answer I had given our mother. "I want to understand why none of you thought I mattered until the building became a problem." Kevin didn't respond immediately. Instead, he stared at the table. Eventually, he sighed. "I never thought you'd leave." There it was again, the same assumption, the same mistake. Not because they respected me, because they expected me to stay no matter what, stay after being ignored, stay after being excluded, stay after being pushed aside. The more I thought about it, the more I realized something. My family had never intentionally planned to depend on me. Dependence happened slowly, one responsibility at a time, one sacrifice at a time, one problem solved without recognition, until eventually everyone assumed those things would simply continue forever. Then one day, they stopped, and suddenly nobody knew what to do. Over the following weeks, the situation became worse. The company's attorneys recommended negotiating a long-term lease. The accountants warned that relocation costs could seriously damage profits. Several department managers privately admitted they didn't know how a move could happen without disrupting operations. Meanwhile, the board continued searching for alternatives. Every option looked expensive. Every solution created new problems. For the first time in years, Mercer Mechanical wasn't focused on growth. It was focused on survival. Ironically, that reminded me of the company I had known 23 years earlier. The company nobody believed would last. The company I had risked everything to help save. One afternoon, Kevin requested a final meeting. This time, no lawyers attended, no accountants, no board members, just the two of us. When I arrived, he looked older than I remembered. Not physically, emotionally, like someone carrying a weight he never expected to carry. For a few minutes, neither of us spoke. Then Kevin finally said something I never thought I would hear. I was wrong. The words hung in the air, simple, direct, unexpected. He admitted that he had spent years confusing visibility with value. He admitted that the family had overlooked countless contributions because they happened behind the scenes. And he admitted that removing me from the company had been a mistake. Not because I owned the building, because they had forgotten everything else. For the first time since our father's death, the conversation felt honest. No excuses, no negotiations, just truth. And the truth was simple. The building had exposed a problem that existed long before the leadership meeting. My family stopped appreciating what they couldn't easily see. Then they convinced themselves it wasn't important. Now they were finally learning the cost of that mistake. The same mistake would soon force them to make a decision they never imagined they would have to make. A week after my conversation with Kevin, the board made a decision. Not because they wanted to, because they had run out of options. The numbers were impossible to ignore. Relocating Mercer Mechanical would cost millions. Operations would be disrupted for months. Several major clients had already expressed concerns, and every alternative property came with problems of its own. For the first time in company history, the people running the business were facing a reality they couldn't negotiate away. They needed the building. More accurately, they needed the person who owned it. A special board meeting was scheduled. This time, I received an invitation. Not as an employee, not as a former executive, as a stakeholder whose approval suddenly mattered. The irony wasn't lost on me. Just a few weeks earlier, they had voted me out of the room. Now they were asking me to come back, When I entered the conference room, the atmosphere felt completely different. Nobody looked confident. Nobody looked victorious. The same people who had spoken so confidently during the leadership meeting now seemed cautious, almost uncomfortable. For a moment, nobody spoke. Then my mother broke the silence. She apologized, not for one decision, for years of decisions, years of assumptions, years of taking my presence for granted. My sisters followed. Even the attorney seemed relieved that someone had finally said what everybody already knew. Then Kevin stood. He looked around the room before speaking. I spent years believing I was carrying this company. He paused. The truth is, I only carried the parts people could see. Nobody interrupted. Nobody disagreed. Because everyone knew he was right. Kevin admitted that he had confused recognition with contribution, visibility with value, credit with responsibility. The room remained silent, not because people were shocked, because they were finally being honest. For the first time since my father's death, nobody was pretending anymore. The conversation lasted nearly 3 hours. There were discussions about leases, future ownership, governance, long-term planning. But none of those things ended up being the most important part. The most important part was accountability. My family finally acknowledged something they should have acknowledged years earlier. Mercer Mechanical wasn't built by one person. It survived because different people carried different responsibilities, some visible, some invisible. And the invisible ones had been ignored for far too long. In the end, I agreed to a new arrangement, not because I needed revenge, and not because I wanted control. I agreed because hundreds of employees depended on the company, families depended on those jobs, customers depended on those services. They shouldn't suffer because leadership had made mistakes. A new long-term lease was signed. The company would remain in the building. But several things changed. Major decisions now required broader oversight. Ownership structures became transparent. Responsibilities became documented. And for the first time, nobody could pretend they didn't know who owned the property. 6 months later, Mercer Mechanical was stable again. The crisis had passed. The company survived. But the relationships inside the family were different. Some damage doesn't disappear simply because people apologize. Trust takes longer. Trust has to be rebuilt. Still, something important had changed. The truth was finally out in the open. Not just about the building, about everything. Looking back, I don't think the building was ever the real issue. The building was simply proof that value and recognition are rarely the same thing. For years, people saw Kevin because he stood in front of the company. They overlooked me because I stood behind it. But when pressure arrived, appearances stopped mattering. Only reality remained. And reality has a way of exposing truths that people spend years ignoring. A year later, Kevin and I attended an industry conference together. During a panel discussion, someone asked him what the biggest leadership lesson of his career had been. He didn't hesitate. Never underestimate the people doing work behind the scenes. The audience nodded. Most people probably thought it was a generic leadership answer. I knew better, because I knew exactly where that lesson came from. For years, my family believed the company could function without me. Then they discovered the difference between replacing a title and replacing a foundation. The building wasn't what saved me. The building simply revealed the truth. And the truth was that the things holding an organization together are often the things nobody notices until they're gone. Looking back, the biggest lesson from this experience had nothing to do with property ownership. And it certainly had nothing to do with winning. For years, I believed that if I worked hard enough, people would eventually recognize my value. I thought results would speak for themselves. I thought loyalty would be remembered. I thought sacrifice would be appreciated. But life doesn't always work that way. Sometimes people become so accustomed to your contributions that they stop noticing them altogether. Not because they're cruel, not because they're evil, because they assume you'll always be there. That's exactly what happened in my family. They didn't wake up one day and decide to forget my role. They simply got used to it, year after year, problem after problem, until my presence felt permanent. And anything that feels permanent eventually becomes invisible. The building didn't change my worth, it only revealed it. The truth is, my value existed long before anyone acknowledged it. The difference was that, this time, ignoring it came with consequences. And sometimes that's the only thing that forces people to see what was in front of them all along. What surprised me most wasn't losing my position, and it wasn't discovering who supported Kevin. It was realizing how easily people confuse familiarity with appreciation. The more dependable you become, the more others begin to treat your efforts as something automatic, something expected, something guaranteed, until one day you stop providing it. That's when they finally notice how much you were carrying, not because your value suddenly increased, because your absence made that value impossible to ignore. And I think that's a lesson that applies far beyond business. Sometimes the people who contribute the most receive the least recognition, not because their work doesn't matter, but because everyone assumes they'll keep showing up no matter what. So, let me ask you something. If your family spent years taking your sacrifices for granted, then suddenly appreciated you only after realizing how much they needed you, would you forgive them? Comment 1 if you would give them another chance. Comment 2 if some lessons should come too late. I'd love to hear your honest opinion.